Chapter 18. On faced the terrible woman before her. Her eyes blazed green like living emeralds, and her hair was so red it seemed to drip blood. She was beautiful as angels are beautiful, painfully perfect, and terrible to behold. The kind of woman who makes you tremble in fear that she might notice you, but fear you might die if she does not. On loved her, knelt before her, swearing she would do anything for her, but say the word, "Thy will be done." The woman smiled, wringing On's heart with terror and elation, and then her white arms gathered her to her breast and lifted her as one would a child. She carried On to the forge and laid her on the bed of coals, raked them over her as gently as one would tuck in a child. Indeed, On felt childlike, and that thought hurt her more than knowing what was to come. The coals were hot, and they hurt. The pain blossomed around her body like flowers bursting from bud to full flower in a moment, and felt so good, comforting. But it grew, swelling past bearable into the realms of hellfire and damnation, and she began to wonder the wisdom of her choice. She tried to scream, but there were no lungs any more to gather air to make the sound. When it reached past the point of endurance, when she thought she should have been dead 100 times over, that white hand reached in and gathered her up like so much loose floss, and set her on the anvil, and took up the hammer, and began to make. There was love in that hand. With every stroke of that awful hammer, every burst of pain forcing her body into an unnatural form, she felt her love. The terrible woman loved the work of making, loved her enough to make her perfect, loved who she was being made for. In the end, everything but love was melted away and pounded out of her, till there was nothing left but the ultimate expression of the Queen's love. When she was perfect, and thought she could bear her touch no more, she was cast away, thrown into the sea, and forgotten. That sea was terrible and battering. There was no light, no air, no love, no emotion, no anything but the Leviathan and the salt and the current and the darkness and eternity. She wasn't drowning. She couldn't drown. One had to need to breathe to drown. But it was lonely, bone-crushingly lonely. All that sustained her was the love which had made her, and the promise that there would be more. Just when she thought she had been forgotten and had begun to grow dim, the white hand gathered her up and took her to her breast, polished her with her own hand. Life had purpose again. She waited to be slipped upon that white hand and was disappointed once more. She was placed upon the finger of a child. It was a bizarre, marriage-like ceremony, the taking of this child as a daughter, as one would take a man to wed. She was the symbol of that promise. Her purpose was to remind the child to love. But something went wrong, and the child disobeyed, rebelled, had the audacity to love another, to choose another over her mother. Then there was another little girl, killing the first. The ring knew what she had been up to, had made sure her mother knew where she was, if not what she was doing. She could only pass on the depth of the child's love. Then the second girl took her from the first, put her on, and loved her mother, made the same promise. But always something happened and the love lessened, felt suffocating as the girls grew up. The Queen began to realize what the problem was and fixed it. As the next girl grew up, she made her a child again, and again, and again. 100 years of growing up, and love slipped. Not much, but the beginning. The child ran away. She loved, but she needed space to breathe. She loved still, but there were questions. Other loves creeping in and beginning to outweigh her. The child would die soon. It started over again. She stood before the Red Queen in all her glory, was reforged while a pale raven watched, languished at the bottom of the cold deep with that dark eye still somehow upon her. It was not until the first runaway that the raven did more than watch. It attacked. Before the new child could slip the ring onto her finger, the raven snatched up the ring and flew. Something followed. There was a man in the road, hair as white and wild as the snow that fell around them. He pulled her from the ring, ripping her body from the golden form to cast her, gasping and drenched, onto the snow-covered ground. The gold he threw from them, standing over her and drawing a pair of axes and facing what the ring became. An turned her head, saw a serpent so red it was almost black rising up, lunging for her. Her mind substituted something else for that serpent's head as it came down, a fomor, clawed and similarly fanged, spitting the poison that burned away her eyes. She rolled out from between the man's feet and found herself facing a snowbank, saw a knob of wood buried in the snow. Her initial panic became anger, and she seized the knob and pulled it from its grave. It was not Capine, not here, but it was a shillelagh, and it would suffice. She got up, turning to the man standing only in trousers and an open vest holding the axes. He put her in mind of a Native American brave wielding tomahawks and an ancient Celtic warrior with war axes, all at once. She strode to his side, and as he ducked beneath the serpent's strike, cutting for the lower coils, An swung the shillelagh over his back at the monster's eye. As he spun up and out of the way, he seemed surprised to see her fighting, but did not allow it to affect him beyond adjusting his style to work with her. Without a word, the two of them harried the beast. An quickly learned that her stick did less actual damage than the axes, yet almost always caused the snake to strike at her, annoyed. She began to time this, hitting it whenever it was about to attack her partner, and twisting out of the way in time, leaving him the opening to hack at the thing's neck. Between the two of them, the thing eventually lay in pieces in the snow. Then, even that turned to smoke and evaporated. They looked across the road at each other. They were bloody, only a little of it their own, and they were tired, and they were laughing. He cleaned his axes, putting them away. "You fight like a right Fianna with that thing." She looked down at the stick in her hand. It had taken some damage and would probably not last another fight, but then it wasn't Capine. "It got me Irish up," she growled, forcing herself to calm down. She tossed the stick aside. "I could be better. You need to learn a better style, though. That one, it's good, but there's a few things you do with a shillelagh you don't learn with a screamer." "A screamer?" "That fighting style is called a screamer. It's a Philippine stick fighting. Dangerous, don't mistake me, but you wield a true shillelagh. You should know the true style. Ian can teach you." An sounded indignant as she stood straighter, having finally begun to catch her breath. "He's the one sent me to Juan." Johnny laughed, shrugged. "Ah, well, ask him anyway. You've proved you're ready for it." An looked down at the stained road where the snake had been. "That why I kept having that nightmare?" "Aye," he nodded. "If only it were a nightmare. I was hoping that's all it were. But I saw it watching, waiting. It was feeding off the pain, trying to eat into your heart and draw you closer to her. It hadn't a good hold yet. That last, these were more detailed," she began. "They started earlier, lasted longer. I lost my sense of self almost completely. I had a few reputations than I think I would have." He nodded. "That's how I saw it, watching it sink its fangs in you. You're not going to want to sit up yet, though," he added. She frowned. What he'd said made no sense, but somehow she was feeling warmer than she should have, and the beginning spiral of dizziness in the back of her head. The edges of the world were blurring a little. "What it did to you is going to take some rest and treatment." "What'd it do?" She felt herself growing weak and lightheaded. She blinked. He wasn't standing in front of her anymore. It took her a moment to realize she was still lying under the firs, and he was sitting at the foot of the bed in the niche with her, watching her with his harp on his lap. "Poisoned you? That you fought for yourself will help with recovery. Means you're strong. But now you've a different sort of fighting to do." He gave her his sad smile. "If your pride can stand a bit of nursing." She gave a dry chuckle at that, laying her head back to stare up at the ceiling. "It don't need nursing. It just resents it." She took a deep breath, closing her eyes against the dizziness. "I hate being a burden." She heard him move from the bed. "You're not a burden. You're letting me feel my purpose. Well, one of them." She opened her eyes and looked over at him. He was doing something at the chest again, flipping open a different latch. She sighed. "Then I suppose I shall have to submit." "You bring many here?" she asked. He gave her a shrugging tip of his head. "As have the extreme need. Thankfully, that's not many. I like this place being a secret. It's my bastion." She watched him bring out a loaf of bread and the makings for a small meal. It was interesting to watch the bard at domestic activities. He sliced cheese and some type of large sausage. He cut 4 slices off the loaf of bread and made fairly thick sandwiches for them. He brought hers over with a skin of water and helped her to sit up to eat it. She learned very quickly why he had warned her not to sit up. The room went crazy. He propped her up against the wall, helped her to drink a little water at first. He made her eat, though that was the last thing she wanted at the moment. She had to admit she felt better when she had. He settled her back down after he was satisfied she had eaten enough. Now you need to sleep, and can do so without fear. She didn't want to. She was in his bed, and her sense of propriety was beginning to rear its stubborn head. But she found she had little choice. Her body betrayed her and began to suck her down into that soft, fluffy oblivion where dreams are safe and pleasant and meaningful. And her own. The last thing she was aware of was his fingers brushing against her temple and the sound of his voice tipping her over the brink back into sleep. It was nearly evening when Anne finally got home, feeling better than she had in some time. The lights came on in the house, welcoming her before she got in the door. She laughed as she felt the joyous vibrations beneath the soles of her boots, even as she hurried to get them off. She was just slipping out of her stockings when there came an insistent knocking on the door. She set her hose in her boots, out of sight, and opened it. Skye stood there, scowling. He looked wild. "Aye?" she asked, completely dispensing with the proprieties. "Where the devil you been?" he growled. That got her Irish up. The fist not holding the door went to her hip. "And what the devil be it your business to know, might I ask?"
"You know what business,"
he snapped.
"I've been worried sick."
That was too much. "I'm gone one bloody night and you get your kilt in a wad. You're taking a step too far, you Highland ninny." He looked like he was about to choke.
"One night, lass. It's been 3 since I've seen the windows glow."
Anne paled as the house confirmed how long it had been. She had thought the house was happy she was cured, not that it had missed her. Skye took in her reaction and backed off a bit, but only a little.
"Aye, 3 days. I know I've been busy, but damn it, lass, a word would have been nice. The tellow's called and everything."
"Wait, called who? They don't know about Ian." He shook his head.
"Can I not have this conversation on your stoop?"
She suddenly remembered her manners and stepped out of his way. He came into the house and waited for her to indicate if she wanted to sit at the table or the fire. She closed the door and headed into the kitchen to make the tea the brownie apparently didn't have enough warning to make. She busied herself getting the kettle while Skye took a place at the table. "Who'd they call?"
"The lawyer. Said you were missing Thursday morning and they were worried because you'd been ill."
Anne opened the pantry to get the tea things and saw a steaming plate of food that had to be fresh from Martha's table. She closed the door again, looked back at Skye. "Have you had your supper?" Skye's stomach growled in response, and Anne waited a moment before opening the pantry again and fetching both plates that now waited inside. She set the largest servings before him and the smaller portion at her chair, and turned back to the fridge to fetch something for them to drink, needing something more than tea for a meal. She pulled out her phone, realized belatedly that she had the smart one, the one without the buttons, and had to ask it to call the manor. The phone rang directly to Ian's office. When he answered, he sounded a little harried.
"On?"
he said immediately, without preamble. She wondered how he had known it was her. I'm fine," she replied. She heard his breath of relief. She also heard him pull the phone away from his mouth and let loose a string of obscenities, then bellow out the door about calling off the hounds. Anne blushed. Skye held out his hand.
"Let me see the phone a mo."
Reluctantly, she handed it over, not relishing Ian's voice raised in anger at her. Skye did something to it and set it on the table between them. A few seconds later, Ian's voice came from the phone much louder than before.
"Tell me what happened,"
he asked, calmer than he had before.
"Are you all right? Where were you?"
She started to pick it up to answer, but Skye shook his head.
"You're on speaker. Don't ask, just talk. I don't ken it much either."
"I'm better than I have been, and I can't tell you where I was, as I don't rightly know."
"Were you taken?"
Ian asked. Anne gave a little laugh. In a manner of speaking, just not how you're thinking."
"Silhouette said you left Wednesday night with Johnny,"
Ian said. Skye's eyes went hard at that.
"We didn't know if you made it home or not, as you don't usually let the Tallows know when you get in, or often when you leave,"
he added, a hint of annoyance in his voice.
"When we couldn't find Johnny to ask."
She sighed. "You fared the worst. No, I had some issues to deal with, and he was affecting a healing Liberty can't," she said, reluctant to explain. "I'd have let someone know if I'd known it was going to take 3 days. If you'll tell the Tallows, or have them told, that she sighed. "Tell them I had a spell of exhaustion and ended up in hospital. They'll believe that. And it's not far from true. Torrance a traditional hospital, but it'll serve. Tell him I was being treated for insomnia. There was a noise from Ian's end as the door opened, and a soft voice sent a chill down her back, even though she had no idea what had been said. Johnny had apparently wasted no time. Ian came back on the line.
I'll get back with you on this. You rest. I'll have Tiffany informed to Talos.
Tell them I'll be home in the morning, she sighed. Thank you, Chief. Uncle, she corrected quickly.
I'll have Tis tell them you'll be at your uncle's recouping and you'll be home Monday,
he insisted.
And I'll expect a full story tomorrow after dinner.
With that he hung up, and Anne was left sitting there being glared at by Skye. She stabbed her pot roast with her fork. What? She snapped. She suddenly realized she was incredibly hungry. So, he scowled, you went home with the bard. She flushed. If you weren't sitting across my table, Skye O'Keefe, I'd slap you silly for your insinuation, she snarled. Nothing illicit happened. I was getting worse. I couldn't sleep. I think my body had enough of the nightmares and wouldn't let me sleep to save me. The ring attached something to me is the best way I can describe it. Once I'd spent so long out of its reach, it attacked full force. Johnny was there when I reached the ends of my limits. I'd been up 4 days. I was seeing things, writing poetry on the fly. Which reminds me, I need to write that down. It was good. Skye ate in silence, not taking his eyes from her, not letting her stop talking. He figured out it were a dreaming issue and took me to his, what do you call it, dream fortress? A bastion? A haven, really. He sealed it and went into my dream. He watched it, saw the thing, and we battled it. That is all there were. He helped me through the weakness after. Apparently the thing had been poisoning me, in a manner of speaking. I left the very next morning. Well, after only one sleep. I guess it was a long one, though time often flows differently twixt there and here. Nothing untoward happened. He growled through his potatoes, angry with himself and Johnny. Anne aimed a fork at him. No, you stop whatever thoughts are in your fool head right there. I don't care what happens. I don't care what he does or doesn't do. Unless I tell you you can thump him, you're not to lay a hand on him over me. You ken? He opened his mouth to argue. Her fork lashed out and struck the back of his hand right across the tendon. He yelped and pulled it back, giving her the same look he'd likely given his mother after getting popped by a wooden spoon with equally impossible swiftness. In spite of the fog banks that made up her eyes, he could feel the threat behind them and quailed. There was no fighting it. Fine. She went back to eating as if nothing had happened. When she spoke again, her voice was casual, but hiding a very real threat. Hurt him and I'll never forgive you. That was why he'd given in. He sighed, nodding. Besides, if I'm of a mind to have him hurt, I'll do it my bloody self, she finished, putting a bite of carrot into her mouth as if she had been talking about rain this afternoon. Skye nearly choked.